In the years following World War II, a chemical hailed as a miracle began to spread across the American landscape. DDT was everywhere. It was sprayed across farmlands and forests, and even over suburban neighborhoods, often released from planes that covered entire areas in a fine chemical mist. To many, it represented progress, science's ability to control nature and eliminate threats that had once seemed unavoidable.
At first, it seemed almost too simple. A single chemical appeared capable of solving problems that had long resisted control. That sense of certainty, however, did not last for long. Rachel Carson, a marine biologist whose writing fundamentally changed how people understood the natural world, was among the first to question the consequences of this widespread chemical use. By the late 1950s, tens of millions of pounds of DDT were being sprayed each year across the US, under the assumption that these landscapes could absorb repeated exposure without lasting effects.
Instead, the chemical moved through soil, water, and plant life, eventually entering the bodies of animals and concentrating as it moved up the food chain. The consequences became visible in bird populations. Bald eagles and other predatory species declined as exposure weakened their eggshells, causing them to collapse during incubation. By the time this damage was recognized, it reflected years of accumulation already embedded in the environment. Carson described this process in Silent Spring with striking clarity.
We poison the gnats in a lake, and the poison travels from link to link of the food chain. The damage did not stop at insects, it spread outward, quietly, until entire systems began to shift.
The implications extended further. DDT accumulated in human bodies as well, passing through food and even from mother to child. Carson did not claim to know every long-term effect, but she made the stakes clear. Releasing a persistent chemical at this scale without fully understanding its consequences meant accepting risks that could not easily be reversed. When Silent Spring was published in 1962, it reached a massive audience almost immediately. By April 1963, it had sold over 500,000 copies and became one of the most controversial books in the US. Carson supported her claims with extensive evidence, including over 50 pages of references and the backing of leading scientists who publicly defended her work. Despite this, the backlash was immediate and aggressive.
So environmentalists worship her, I say. She's a mass murderer.
Chemical companies and affiliated organizations spent nearly $2.5 million in efforts to discredit Carson, while public attacks questioned her credibility, her expertise, and even her mental stability.
Critics warned that her ideas would return society to a dark age of disease and famine, and some went further, claiming that restricting DDT would lead to millions of deaths from malaria. These claims gained traction despite how far they strayed from what she actually argued.
In reality, Carson's position was far more limited. She never called for the complete elimination of pesticides. Her focus remained on overuse, particularly in agricultural spraying, where DDT was applied at a scale far beyond necessity.
She recognized the role insecticides could play in controlling disease and instead argued for a more precise, targeted use. The claim that her work caused a global malaria crisis does not hold up under scrutiny. DDT was never banned worldwide and continued to be used in many countries, especially in public health programs. The resurgence of malaria has been tied instead to inconsistent funding, weakened infrastructure, and a biological reality Carson anticipated: resistance.
Heavy reliance on a single chemical created conditions for mosquitoes to adapt, gradually reducing DDT's effectiveness and in some regions, rendering it ineffective altogether. Carson warned that intensive spraying would accelerate exactly this process.
Yet the response to her work followed a familiar pattern. Decades later, historian Naomi Oreskes described how industries respond when scientific findings threaten their interests, emphasizing uncertainty, discrediting critics, and delaying regulation.
The same figures and institutions that challenged Carson's work later appeared in debates over tobacco and climate change, applying similar strategies to different issues. The objective was not to disprove her claims. It was to prevent argument long enough to avoid change. Carson confronted these attacks while facing something far more personal. During the years she spent writing Silent Spring, she was undergoing treatment for breast cancer, a diagnosis she kept private, aware that it could be used to undermine her credibility. When she testified before Congress in 1963, she appeared in a wig, physically weakened but still calling for stronger environmental protections. Less than a year later, she died, never fully seeing the impact of her work. In the years that followed, the US moved to regulate pesticides more aggressively, eventually banning the agricultural use of DDT in 1972. Her work helped shift public awareness and contributed to the creation of the EPA, along with major environmental legislation such as the Clean Air Act and the Clear Water Act. At its core, she reshaped how people understood the relationship between environmental exposure and human health, arguing that exposure to toxic chemicals was a matter of human rights. Carson spent years urging people to see the natural world as something they were part of. Man is part of nature, she wrote, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. What her critics failed to recognize was that the consequences she described were already unfolding. Thinning eggshells, contamination across the food chain, and growing resistance to pesticides were not hypothetical concerns. They were already visible. Rather than confront that reality, many chose to redirect the conversation, exaggerating her claims and questioning her credibility in ways that made her easier to dismiss. In doing so, they reinforced the very pattern she had warned about. Systems built on unchecked control tend to ignore their own consequences until those consequences become impossible to deny. She did not live to see the world fully catch up to what she had already recognized. She spoke anyway.